Brilliant. So I've decided that to facilitate the IoT discussion, I'd give a quick 5-10 minute overview of the Secure by Design project in DCMS, and then the panel will be discussion, but I will be at the front if there are any very specific questions on DCMS's work. So very quickly, as a background to our project, in early 2017, we've conducted a review. We decided that the area of focus would be on consumer IoT. As the minister's already set out, the two reasons for that were, firstly, to improve the consumer's privacy, safety, and security, but also we've seen previous cybersecurity attacks in the last few years, such as the DIN Internet Service Provider attack, that were based on the use of IoT devices that had weak security. And so we felt that there was a need to improve the security of consumer IoT with the broad premise of making sure that we reduce the burden of consumers by ensuring that cybersecurity is built into consumer IoT products by design. So in 2017, we conducted this review, engaging with over 130 external stakeholders. That was included the likes of industry bodies, and I can see a number of representatives here from people like the Tech UK, FSB, BEMA, Amdea, and others, and then also a wealth of others from consumer groups, academia, and areas of other features, and also international government. And the culmination of that work was a publication of the Secure by Design reports in March 2018, which set out a number of draft proposals, including our code of practice, and then we held an informal consultation to ensure that any stakeholders could provide further feedback. And then in October this year, we published the code of practice in its final form, and it was published alongside a document that mapped the code's guidelines against over 50 UK and international standards to basically ensure that manufacturers had a clear understanding of how the code of practice fitted in with the broader landscape. But I think we all agree today that consumer IoT is not a UK issue. It requires international alignment. And we are taking steps to address that. So we are currently developing a technical specification within ETSI, one of the 3 recognized European standardization bodies. On Tuesday, I was at the European Commission conference presenting on our work to try and highlight the code of practice, but also since the March report, we've been compiling evidence to look at IoT certification because we're very clear that with the EU Cybersecurity Act, the scope of ENISA will be expanding. And so we want to make sure that we have clear evidence to basically help inform their work. And so that's involved things like looking at what information is provided within devices that come with the product. That's also been involving extensive consumer testing. And so, for example, we've been working with Pattison, an academic consortium that has led a project through UCL, specifically conducting consumer surveys on the effectiveness of labeling schemes for IoT. Because when we talk about certification and labeling, we have to think about it within the parameters of things like the code of practice. And I think from our side, when we develop this work going forward, we've also signposted in our October publication that we are developing regulatory options, because I think we'd all agree today that there are a number of devices already in the market that have limited security features. And so we are trying to work out how we could effectively develop options based on some of the code's guidelines to ensure that when products come to market, they have cybersecurity already built in. Because I think our onus and effectiveness has always been on trying to drive that reduce of the burden on the consumer. But we've recognized that that is going to take time. So in October, we also published consumer guidance specifically to help consumers with setting up, managing and improving the security of their devices. And as part of that piece of work, we've been working closely with the National Cybersecurity Centre throughout this project, and I think there'll be a lot of things to continue on with this work. And the last thing I'll say is, if we think of this broader point around developing this international alignment work, we have our ETSI technical specification, but we also are aware of the work that is currently going on in ISO. So there's 27030, which is looking specifically around the areas of security and privacy by design. And I think from our side, feeding into that process, showing the evidence work that DCMS has done, will be very important in building that international alignment. But I will now pass over to the panel.
Wow. That is an impressive amount of work that is being done. We have an interesting set of panelists, but the context here is consumer IoT. And consumer IoT is always in interaction with consumers. And I think that most consumers actually don't, A, realize that they're buying IoT devices, they're buying something else, they're buying a product. That first, and second, they have no idea about the security properties of those products. Frankly, I'm looking for a new television set. I'm in the market for a new television set. I'm looking at a 43-inch television with 4K resolution and 100 Hertz refresh rate. If you look that up, there's only one television in the whole Dutch market, at least, that fits those characteristics. There's only one. So if that has a kite mark or not, I will pick that television because that's the one that I want to have, regardless of the privacy policy that I have to adhere to when I started the television. I have everything installed, and then suddenly I get this message on screen like, this has an Android, this is an Android TV, you know, do you privacy things? Yes, I want to watch television, please. So I think this is what we're onto, and these products are flooding the market. Actually, the other day I saw a baby monitor being advertised on a Telcel channel. And if everything is right, the video is right here. Could you start that video?
I'm so excited by this next product, Joy. Tell me all about it.
Well, Steve, like any new parent, I want to keep a watchful eye on my little cherub. And with the Buggle Baby Monitor, I can. But here's the kicker. Cyber criminals can too.
Cyber criminals? What do you mean, Joy?
Well, because it connects online and has no real security, it's super easy to hack. So the camera and speaker can be controlled by total strangers online.
So someone could be watching my child without me knowing?
That's right, Steve. And talking to them too.
Wow, that is terrifying.
It really is. But there's more. It can also be used to access other smart devices in your home. Like if you're watching TV, they can be watching and listening to you.
Let's go to the phones. We've got Silas on the line. Silas, so what do you think of the baby monitor?
Personally, I love it. I can use it to find out all kinds of information about you. Your pet's name, when your birthday is, which is really helpful when I'm trying to get into your bank account.
Silas.
Love the show, guys.
Thanks, Silas, you rascal.
Okay, Joe, I'm convinced. I love it. What's the price?
Well, it retails for only $74.99, but could end up costing you your peace of mind, your privacy, your savings.
Now that is a steal.
Thank you.
Steal. The price.
Oh, we get to see the rerun fast. I have to observe here, though, that Silas apparently is a Londoner. I'm not very good at the accents, but let's get to the serious work. We have on our panel, we have a set of well-qualified people that have been participating in the development of the code of conduct and have been also commenting on it and will be commenting on it. I'm going to introduce you all shortly, just say something about your background, and then after that we'll do a round of first remarks. Starting with Stephen here. Stephen, can you introduce yourself?
I'm Stephen Pattison. I'm from a company called ARM. We design microprocessors, in case you've never heard of us. We think the Internet of Things is probably going to run on ARM designs and a couple of others as well, I guess. I'm not sure there's much I can say that's very interesting about my background. I used to sell vacuum cleaners, and I'm very proud of that.
Which are now also smart devices, by the way. So, with cameras and a lot of intelligence in them. So, Eva, you're not on the deck, but you are.
I am now. It's been fixed. Okay. Yes.
Perfect.
Hi, yes, I'm Eva Blum-Dumontet. I'm a researcher at Privacy International. So as the name suggests, we defend the right to privacy across the world. I guess my particular background that would be relevant for this panel is that I've been working on gender and in particular sponsoring research by UCL on the impact of the Internet of Things on domestic violence.
And more about that in a short while, I guess. Talal.
Good afternoon, everybody. Hi, my name is Talal Rajab. I'm the Head of Programme for Cyber and National Security at Tech UK. We are the trade association representing the technology industry, so we've got over 950 member companies ranging from your large household names like Google, Microsoft, Apple, etc., all the way down to a wide range of startups and SMEs. I represent the cybersecurity program, and as part of that, we sat on the expert advisory group as part of the DCMS Secure by Default review, so we had some input from the industry perspective as to how the code of practice was developed and produced. So we are a big supporter of it, and I think we'll be speaking about it in a bit more detail later on.
Joyce.
Hello, my name is Joyce Hakmeh. I'm a research fellow at Chatham House, and I'm also the co-editor of the Journal of Cyber Policy. For those who don't know Chatham House, we've been in existence for almost 100 years, and it's a think tank. We look at international affairs, and I'm with the International Security Department, where I lead on cyber policy, and Internet of Things and cybersecurity of Internet of Things and other emerging technologies has been high on our agenda, and I'll be talking a little bit more about that.
And finally, Matthew.
Yes, hi everybody, Matthew Shears. I'm an independent consultant. I work with Global Partners Digital, Global Partners Digital, among others, and I'm a member of the ICANN board. Given that I wear a number of hats, I'm going to be speaking in my personal capacity. Thanks.
I don't know if I introduced myself, but I'm Olaf Kolkman. I'm the Chief Internet Technology Officer of the Internet Society. We're there for an open, globally connected, trustworthy, and secure internet for everyone. That's a whole mouthful. That trustworthy and secure is, as far as I'm concerned, the topic of today's conversation. Let me start with Talal. You've been participating in the development, I think, of the Code of Conduct. Are there a few thoughts that you would want to share?
So I mean, I want to take a look at this really in more of an optimistic angle. At Tech UK, you know, we are a trade association for the tech industry. We want to encourage people to utilize and use emerging technologies, IoT being one of them. So we are, of course, digital optimists. And we want consumers, who I think should be the main focus of this debate, using devices and products with confidence and trust that what they're using is secure and does what it says on the tin or on the box. We have an IoT group, and earlier this year we conducted connected home research, which looked at how consumers purchase IoT products and use them in the home. And our polling showed that nearly half of all consumers, a barrier to adopting an IoT product or service, they cited privacy and security being sort of up there as one of the key barriers. The only downside to that from a cybersecurity perspective is that one of the other key barriers for them was cost. And those two things don't really go hand in hand. So in the one sense, they're saying that privacy and security is very important, but on the other side, they're not willing to pay a premium price for a product or service that has enhanced security on it. So what can we do as the industry to increase that trust, increase that confidence, and encourage more people to utilize IoT products and services? And that's sort of one of the reasons why we were really pleased that DCMS kicked off the Secure by Design review. One reason why we were so keen to sit on the expert advisory group as well and support its conclusions and recommendations. We want to make sure that manufacturers reduce the burden on the consumer. You know, if I think of my mother, if she's buying an internet-connected device, she doesn't understand endpoint security or privacy policies. She doesn't read through all of that stuff. She just wants to go into a shop, go on the shelf, pick out a product, you know, read the back of the box, it says it's interconnected, it says it does X, Y, and Z, so I'm going to buy this. We shouldn't expect them to understand and fully appreciate a lot of the security requirements that we want our members and manufacturers to put into products and services. So, so that's where I think, you know, I'm sort of approaching this debate. You know, we want to encourage people to utilize technology. We are big supporters of the benefits of IoT and what it can bring to wider society, from sectors like healthcare and energy, but we want to also ensure that things are secure by design, and that's where the onus really should fall on the manufacturer rather than the consumer.
Good. Stephen, would you want to say something from your perspective?
Yes.
Which is the one of a...
When we were in the green room, which sounds very grand, just before this started, I said, this is the last session of the day, and you know, we've got to make it lively and interactive. And it was a bit of a struggle, really, because actually I rather agree with what Edward and DCMS has been doing, and Talal obviously agrees, because he was on the same side. But so I think if we're going to make this really useful, we've got to look at it in a slightly different way. And I do agree with a lot of what DCMS has been doing. The but that's coming is, you know, I think there's a risk here that we're fighting the last war. And it's a risk, I mean, military planners incur this risk all the time, that it's easy to rerun what happened when you had the last attack and how you could have avoided it. And you assume that the conditions are going to be the same. Well, of course, in the tech world, the conditions are not going to be the same. The conditions are changing all the time and with incredible speed. And the measure of our success will be how we react to the next security crisis, the next incident that happens. And yes, regulation, whether you go for voluntary or whether you go for mandatory regulation, can set, if you like, a minimum bar. And that's probably a good thing. But that's all it is. It is a minimum bar. If the tech sector is going to keep ahead, the tech sector's got to move really fast. Because the hackers will be moving really fast too. And I was impressed by the hacker who appeared in that video, Silas or someone. And I always ask this question of people who are in the industry. Why do so many people who are really good at coding go over to the dark side? I've never had a sensible answer to that. But there is something weird. It's not like we get a lot of surgeons who go over to giving, you know, criminals facelifts. But somehow in this area, there is a real threat from very competent hackers. And don't forget, old cliche, a hacker only has to find one vulnerability, whereas if you're trying to protect the system, you're protecting against lots. And I heard just yesterday, so I'm not sure whether this is true, but I'll pass it on. I heard it from a security company, that when you look at software, there's statistically, apparently, a risk of a bug in every 25,000 lines of code. You might think, if you know nothing about this, that sounds a tolerable risk. But if you're looking at the future connected car, I'm not going to invite you to guess, 500 million lines of code in a connected car. This is what I was told. So you begin to see that the system actually needs to be protected, guarded, watched over all the time with people using cutting-edge technology. We, ARM, have proposed that what we need in this area is a kind of digital social contract. A contract between the industry and the people, if you like, which basically says, we, the industry, that sounds a bit like the beginning of a really important document, we, the industry, undertake to make the system as secure as we can. Wow, hugely difficult, and you're all thinking that's never going to happen. And I'm not going to underestimate the difficulties. But it's not impossible. Come back to a little bit of creating normative standards from DCMS and others, and a little bit of industry really recognizing that security is what's going to build trust, and if you don't have trust, you don't have a business. And we saw a bit of the sector coming together early this year. Early this year, it was disclosed that there were some vulnerabilities in the basic design of microprocessors, as these are called, Spectre and Meltdown vulnerabilities. And the industry came together, actually, and worked out mitigations for those really very fast and coordinated public announcements so that the public announcements were only made when the mitigations were ready. So we're beginning to see a little bit of this. Arm, as a company, we sit, if you like, at the bottom of the food chain. So our hope is that if we can, if you like, inject stuff into the bottom of the food chain, it gets taken up. So we spend an awful lot of time trying to make sure that what we're doing at those very early stages of microprocessor design and connectivity employ pretty high-grade security. And the key here is, and this again comes back to the last war. You know, we were, for a long time, our security has been based on intrusion detection. But what we really need to think of now is intrusion protection, is protecting against intrusions. And one of the areas where we're working very hard is the use of artificial intelligence to do this. So in a nutshell, you use artificial intelligence to monitor the whole digital landscape, and it very quickly identifies areas where anomalies are happening. And those anomalies can raise suspicions. It might just be a fault, but it might also be the beginnings of someone trying to do something nefarious with the system. And then you can move very quickly to try to isolate those dodgy bits and protect the whole of the system. And this kind of takes intrusion protection even further, and it takes it in the direction of threat hunting, actively patrolling, monitoring the network, using AI to try to find those early signs that there is someone else crawling around the network who's up to no good.
So Stephen, I'm going to interrupt you for a while because I have a question. I have a small question for clarification that goes a little bit back, and I also want to give the opportunity to the rest of the audience, of the panelists. You said a digital contract where we commit to being responsible for our security. What is the expectation of the consumer in that digital contract that you...
Well, I think it grows entirely out of what we've been talking about today, really, the shift from I mean, was it ever? But the shift from thinking that consumers can take responsibility for, you know, their own security to business having to take, or the industry having to take responsibility for providing secure stuff. Mm-hmm. And I think that's the essential shift, and that's happened actually quite quickly, I think.
That's good. Yep. I think that the point that you made, essentially, minimal standards will get you to compliance thinking, not related to security thinking, is a very important one. So thank you for that. Eva.
I'd like to go back on some of the points that have been made because, Talal, I think very rightfully you sort of mentioned the issue of the onus that should be on the companies and not on the consumers. And I think that it is something we all agree on, but this is why I was actually quite surprised from the DCMS report, which is, I mean, it was very good with lots of good ideas in it, but I was surprised not to find the term liability in it, because I think that that's one of the big questions and the big challenge of the IoT debate, because at the moment, when you look at a piece of software, the company that designs the software sort of, well, isn't liable in the sense that the moment the user will sign and agree to the end-user agreements, they sort of discharge a responsibility by having the consumer agreeing to the end-user agreement. It's different, obviously, if you have a physical object, in the sense that if you have a dishwasher that suddenly floods your house, the company that sold you the dishwasher will be responsible. So, or your insurance company. But so the question will be, with the IoT devices, the moment you have a piece of software that's controlling a physical object, then, you know, where is the liability? Because you will be signing most likely an end-user agreement on the software that you're using for this object. So the question of liability, I think, really needs to be addressed. I'd also like to answer your question, Stephen, about why do so many hackers go to the dark side? Well, actually, because there is a lot of money to be made, because governments actually are some of the first purchaser of exploit that they sell on the so-called dark web, which is really just a code word for Tonian services. But and so that raises actually the question of the responsibility of governments in cybersecurity in general, because as I said, it's all very well having the DCMS doing excellent recommendations on securing IoT devices, and having on the other side GCHQ that purchase exploits to be able to spy on people. So I think that's also something we need to address, is the kind of dual interest of governments on this.
Thank you. I'm frantically making notes because you're turning to an aspect of what's the role of states in cyber stability here, which is I think a separate dossier, although clearly interlinked. Joyce, would you like to share your perspective?
Sure, thank you. So I just maybe organize my thoughts or my comments around the code of practice, talk a little bit more about that, and in particular about three main points. So the code of practice for consumer IT security is definitely a welcome step, and I think we all agree on that. It's a unique step and an important start to initiate a dialogue between the public and private sectors, especially that IoT is inherently a shared ecosystem and operating model. I think the code is also helpful for other countries, for them to start thinking about their consumers' IoT security as well, and to start a conversation around that too. So the main added value is aligning security expectations and creating a common language. And Secretary General talked about common language, and I think the issue of having a common language when we talk about the technology threat is of utmost importance. There's a need to create a common language in IoT cybersecurity and to engage in a structured dialogue. And this will help decrease the disconnect between the engineers, the cybersecurity experts, policymakers, and will assist the global dialogue. Now, there are, of course, limitations or things that we need to think about and keep in mind when we talk about these things. So the first that comes to mind is obviously enforceability. So the code is currently only a guideline, and it is voluntary, which means that it will be most likely considered by organizations that have the will, the capacity, the skills and resources to abide by its guidelines. But there are organizations, including vendors and supporting supply chains, who won't. So until regulatory options are developed and implemented, there is currently little incentive to build secure IoT devices, as there are market demands, and Talal talked a little bit about that, for low costs combined with low barriers to entry. So from this perspective, IoT security is also an economic problem rather than just a technological one. From an international point of view, and that's a very important point that I'd like to make, and it's not just about IoT cybersecurity. I mean, most of us were in Paris, but also in different other activities around cyberspace and stuff like that, and we can't really separate the discussion from that. So from an international point of view, IoT is a global ecosystem, as we said, and as the UK can only be as secure as the weakest link in the chain, we should be concerned about who's around the table and with whom are we having this conversation. So China, as we all know, is a key player in the global IoT ecosystem. The Mirai botnet relied heavily on devices manufactured in China. So China is pushing to be a manufacturing superhouse as part of its Made in China 2025. And IoT is said to be a major pillar in its economy. Some predict that by 2020, 95% of IoT devices will be made in China. I don't know how much this number is accurate, but it is definitely telling. So for IoT security to be successful, China and other big players must be part of the process. Like when we talk about cyberspace, when we talk about other elements, we need to have the perpetrators, the like-minded, everyone around the table to be able to actually make a difference. So national initiatives are definitely a welcome step. But without international consensus, IoT bad practice in one country has repercussions on global IoT security. So there's a need for homogenization at a policy and international level if IoT cybersecurity is to be effective. My second point actually links to what our three speakers have said about like shifting the mentality of, or let's say the burden of security to the manufacturers, which I think, the duty of care to third parties is definitely of utmost importance. But given that we're not there yet, right? And given that the nature of threats keep changing, I think this narrative of like, don't worry, we'll take care about it, risks downplaying each person's responsibility in her and her own security. Consumers, when we talk about cybersecurity more generally, governments, particularly the UK government, has been investing a lot of effort to raising awareness in terms of how we behave online, like how do we practice more cyber hygiene, what do we need to do in order to protect ourselves from cyber attacks. So I think, our cybersecurity or IoT cybersecurity should also be part of that narrative. We shouldn't separate and say, use IoT, kind of don't think very much about security because that's what the manufacturer's responsibility. But when you go online to, to kind of check your banking, do digital transactions, whatever that might be, have to be vigilant, etc. I think that's all part of one mindset, one thinking, and we should always be advocating for security and for having like good practices online. So my point is they're not mutually exclusive. So yes, we want to advocate for security by default, but also advocate for cyber hygiene and kind of advocate for both as strongly. And lastly, the idea of having a proactive approach when we think about cybersecurity of IoT. Threats are constantly evolving, and the IoT botnet Mirai in 2016, as you all know, relied on default passwords, which was something that the code addresses. But the botnet repo that happened in 2017 used software to overcome passwords. So the way they're doing the attacks is changing, really. So this means that while the code of conduct requires no default password, and that's definitely a good practice, some IoT threats have evolved beyond this vulnerability. So the increased connectivity that will arise from 5G, the possibility of IoT ransomware, and attacks on smart cities in the context of industrial IoT. And I know we're talking here more about consumer, but this is all part of the basically picture. They must be considered rather than just guidelines based on previous IoT vulnerabilities or like one framework and just we shove everything under it. So I think the most fruitful approach would be to assess IoT security proactively and to establish common codes of practice across industries. And I think that's one of the basically objectives of the code, and across national jurisdictions. And I believe we all agree and realize that at the moment there is no silver bullet, and that's important for the conversation. What we can do is start a security culture and changing the mindset step by step. Even if different initiatives are less than perfect, and even if they achieve partial results and are contested by some, as long as they push the debate further, they are a success in their own merit. So what we need to do is keep the conversation going so we can collectively identify the best way forward.
Perfect. Let's keep the conversation going with Matthew.
Thanks, Olaf. So I'm going to build a little bit on what Joyce has said and everybody else's comments. Some excellent comments have been made. So I want to talk a little bit also about the user to manufacturer shift, and then also about the international dimension. If you go on one of the large online platform shopping spaces and search for smart light bulbs or smart devices or whatever, you might stumble across a brand of smart light bulb. And if you search among the 394 questions asked about that particular type of light bulb, you won't find any reference to changing the default password or whether or not the security is upgradable. So You will find, however, 30 or 40 questions about the different hues of light that can be achieved with that light bulb. So, but I think this is a point that I think is worth remembering when we talk about shifting the responsibility from the user to the manufacturer, is that we still need to change the mindset from the old world of cyber hygiene, which effectively was the kind of washing the hands and brushing your teeth, to something far more complex now, where we're talking about cyber health. And within that framework of cyber health, the user effectively is a part of that network now, a part of that health ecosystem, if you will. So I think while, yes, we need to look at how we shift the burden, if you will, from the user to the manufacturer, at the same time, it's very important that we not lose track of the importance of bringing a greater level of awareness to those who are connecting devices to the network. And in fact, I'm just going to read 2 lines from Mozilla's 2018 Internet Health Report, where they say, I think very accurately, for every device with either no password or a bad one, the internet becomes a little more fragile and dangerous. But people buy things, connect them to the internet, and never think about securing them as long as they work. So that's a fundamental reality that we have to continue to address. So that's that point I wanted to make on that side. And I think it's far more than just cyber hygiene now. We really do have to see ourselves as part of the ecosystem, part of the network, effectively, once we start connecting these types of devices, and many of them, to the network. The other point is on the international dimension. This is an incredibly important initiative, and I'm glad there's an international dimension, and you mentioned about cooperating with European partners and others. This is, as Joyce has said, that we can't look at this in isolation as a UK thing at the moment. I mean, we're in a global internet. In other words, these types of devices are going to be used in other parts of the world. We have, I'm just going to pull up the Global Commission on the Stability of Cyberspace has just released a set of norms. In fact, they were released at the IGF, or they were talked about at the IGF to some greater extent. And one of those norms says, state and non-state actors should not commandeer others' ICT resources for use as botnets or for similar purposes. Now, that's a great norm, but it's a little bit undermined by the reality on the ground in terms of the accessibility of these IoT devices and the lack of security to those who would seek to use them to do harm. So we have a collective responsibility to address that issue.
However, Matthew, being a commissioner,
a
commissioner on that commission, I should also say that it has a norm on basic cyber hygiene. That was part of that same norm package where there is a call out for non-state actors to actually get their shit together.
Right. Which is a great way of putting it, yes. Thanks, Olaf. but my point remains. I think that we have a global collective responsibility as well to address these things. And it means, yes, working at the norms level, but it means working at the ground level too. And I think that's a key element of this discussion. Thanks.
Thank you. That is, there's a lot of alignment, I feel, in what the panelists shared with us. Based on this, I have a question around liability, and perhaps some of the panelists might be able to answer that. I'm always concerned when we talk about measures to address this, that we heard the endless possibilities that innovation brings. We are at the start of I think, and this is where I share the optimism, I think we are at the start of an enormous journey that can bring us a lot of good, and this is where I share the pessimism. It can also bring us enormous bad. But let's assume that we want the enormous good out of this, then thinking about what are the things that can have sideways effects. And I think liability is one of these things that worries me, because a lot of the development in the internet is based on open source. A lot of the tool sets that actually bring us security are based on open source. And usually they have big, first there are no commercial backers behind those products. And what could be the side effect of liability for the people who write that type of code? So that's one question. Another question, and I'd like the panel to pick up on either one, is Bruce Schneier recently wrote something that I found interesting, and I haven't really concluded whether that observation is right, but he always talks about security being in essence an economic proposition. And he says, if you have I'm paraphrasing, if you have a large enough market that pushes for certain cybersecurity standards, security minimum standards, then as an organization that produces these things, it makes no sense to develop two product lines, one that is secure and one that is insecure. Once you hit that minimum security standard for one market, it doesn't make any sense to do anything else in another market. We heard about GDPR. We know that for privacy, for instance, people develop different products for different markets because the regulations are simply different and there's money to make from having different privacy standards, so to speak. So I was wondering, with that in mind and looking at the international context, suppose that you only have ETSI, suppose that you only have Europe with these minimal standards. Is that sufficient? So, liability and international aspects, the economics of the... Does anybody in the panel want to comment? And if not, I'm going to ask the audience because we're...
Well, if I take the liability issue to start off with, I mean, it's a great question, and I think it was something that probably was discussed in some of the working groups, but where do you draw the line within the supply chain, particularly a lot of these devices? There is a large, long, global even supply chain with many of the devices we're talking about. So who are we talking about? Are we talking about the end manufacturer that actually puts all these pieces together and puts the products on the shelf? How far back down the supply chain would we go? And I don't think that's a question I wouldn't want government to try and answer that question. Maybe it's something that industry can try and do together, but it just opens up a big can of worms. I think that it's not just an easy answer, but it's definitely a good question to pose.
Can I suggest, sorry,
I actually like this type of interruptions. This is a dialogue with all of us. So.
Vice President of the European Union. When the EU cybersecurity strategy was being developed, she said, gentlemen, to the nations, you need to understand that we inherit US technology in this country. The US has very strong regulations about liability and supply chains for hardware in aerospace, medicine, electronics and elsewhere. The top provider in the manufacturing has legal responsibility for what happens in their supply chain in whatever territory that may be. There is one single exception, and that's software. So we've had huge arguments about what is the liability in software. So the point I would humbly suggest to the UK government is we're in an international supply chain. So please be very careful in understanding what liability might look like. We inherit this. We also inherit, which hasn't been mentioned, export control requirements like ITAR and dual use. They affect a lot of what we buy in this space. Thank you.
Okay, can you wait for the microphone to arrive so that...
I was gatekeeper for a large multinational which was thinking of going into this area. And we decided not to go in because we were big enough to be worth suing. Everybody else were men of straw. It's the insurability of where the buck stops with somebody big enough to be worth suing. Do they go in or don't they? And that has a very interesting set of implications.
So I think that is the point that the question that I'm sort of raising is, you know, what are the side effects of some of these measures? And I'm looking at Edward. I'm looking where he is. Oh, there. You took off your coat. Is this something that was discussed in the preparation of the report?
Well, yeah, absolutely. So we set up the expert advisory group with organizations like Tech UK, BT, consumer groups, etc. And we really discussed this in a lot of detail on the liability. I think Talal's already come to the point around the global supply chain. So you can have instances where companies are part of the supply chain, and then within a month or two, in a company, for example, in Southeast Asia, may not be there again. And so you then have a gap in your supply chain that might be your sort of liability or issue, and how does the company address that? And we had a lot of debates around that, and we're still having that debate, because obviously when we're developing these regulatory proposals, that's something that we need to really consider in a lot of detail. And I think that's part of our discussions going forward. But as one can imagine, across this space, there's a variety of views. And what we don't want to do is stifle innovation. But we also want to make sure that the code fits in within this broader landscape. So it's something that we'll be looking at in the coming months.
Thank you. Any of the panelists want to add something? I'll get to you in a moment. Go ahead.
1, 2, 3. Okay. Thank you. First of all, I'm glad somebody intervened from the floor, because the value of the interaction from the audience is far greater than the wonderful presentations, and I wish we had more of that in the earlier part of the day as well. But let me just put it in proper context on the IoT issue. By the way, Khaled Fattal, MLI Group. Olaf and I were having this conversation before the session, and I presented this fact. If we put it in the right narrative, there are 1 billion internet devices entering the internet every quarter, ladies and gentlemen, with little attention to security or patching. When you put that in the proper context of the global cyber threat, the politically motivated cyber terrorism, the hacking with the purpose to change the direction of nations, and you're just collateral damage, the burden has to be on finding a format that actually protects society. And I go back to the point that Stephen raised earlier on, which Olaf picked up on, but there was a key word missing. Your point was the social contract. The key word was the word social. The contract has to do something with society and the responsibility to society, not necessarily only the liability. Liability is critical. And I actually personally believe that many of the auto industry players who are jumping on this bandwagon because it's so sexy and so entertaining, so wonderful, they don't realize how it could become the thing that could actually shut them down forever. So we need to look at this in the proper narrative, in the proper context, because it is a threat to society. How? You know what? This is part of the debate, this is part of the engagement, and I'm glad we're having this engagement.
I find that an interesting perspective, and I think that we already touched upon it through, for instance, the work of the Global Commission that basically talks to state behavior in cyberspace. And I think that the code of conduct is something that we have seen. The points in the code of conduct, the 13 points, is something that we have seen pop up as a general norm, I would almost say, across the whole planet. There are several pockets where this discussion has been going on, and similar type of norms have been developed. So I'm going to question that. I think you're right. Part of this discussion is about setting out a vision about how to address this. But I do also think...
One last point. Sorry. It's not about setting out the vision, no disrespect. The threat is clear and imminent, and I think Joyce raised it earlier on in alluding to the attack on Dyn in 2016. This was an attack on a DNS provider that shut down many operators and hundreds of websites. Imagine if multiple DNS providers are being attacked at the same time. Ladies and gentlemen,
there are many.
The prospect of people going on without the prospect is that people are 9 years away
Yeah, so yeah, I think so. So what is the action? What is the action? Because I think that that sense of urgency, we were having that conversation, that sense of urgency is actually important. How do we get from what we have now to secure implementations that are sold like in 2 months, not in 20 years, not in 2 years, but like now? How do we get there?
Sorry, I'm not really going to answer that question, but in a sense, I'm troubled by the term imminent threat. It's already a threat in the sense that even, well, it's taking a step back and not even looking at the IoT context, but just the context in general. I mean, we had, was it in 2016 that the NHS was like, we had lots of hospitals being closed, and what was the reason? It wasn't fancy IoT devices. It's because hospitals are running Windows XP. We have people running operating systems that are 20 years old, and we're now going to be equipping like a fridge, locks, toasters, washing machines that are going to be connected to the internet, and we suddenly, this is why my issues with the social contract you mentioned, this is where society is out. And what we're now going to say, oh, you know that thing you click on, like update tomorrow, remind me tomorrow for the update that you do every day? Well, now you're going to have to like take new habits and not do that with your fridge, because otherwise the milk you're drinking is going to go off. Same thing with cars, same thing with suddenly we are going to have objects that could potentially endanger physical lives in the physical world, while we haven't even solved the issue of people updating the software still at the level of like their computers and their phones, with the risk that it already entailed. As I said, like we had hospitals being closed, the risks were real, the harm was real.
Yeah, Joyce.
Can I interject with something? Well, yeah, I agree with what you're saying, and I also think the threat is there. And I think there isn't like, one answer, this is exactly what we should do and we'll all be safe. I think there are, like, we should come at it from different sides and doing different things. But I think one key issue, or like one key thing that, should happen across the board and everywhere is education. Not just education and awareness for us consumers, but also education for policymakers, for the ones who are responsible for making the policies, whether, at the government level, C-suite, etc. I think maybe here the conversation in the UK is at a certain level, but if we go, elsewhere in the world, especially in developing countries that have been kind of pushed to invest in their ICT infrastructure, but with no cybersecurity measures to accompany that, and they open themselves to like massive vulnerabilities. So it's IoT, but it's not just IoT. It's like literally, like what you said, hospitals, and this is the UK we're talking about. We're talking about practices here, but imagine what sort of like a situation you have in other countries. So I think there isn't like one answer. I think we should come at it from different levels, engaging everyone. It's a shared responsibility. It is a social contract. We need to kind of create a common language and level the discussion, not make it extremely technical that people kind of lose interest and I don't really understand what you're talking about. Some people, when they ask me what do you do, I say cybersecurity. I'm like, oh wow, you can hack and do stuff. I'm like, well, actually, more policy level. So kind of like you have to demystify some of the concepts and kind of create something that we all agree on.
Matthew, you wanted to...
Yes, I think it's been used a couple of times now as the word responsibility. And I think, as I said before, we have a shared responsibility. That's manufacturer, that's user, that's government. And until we recognize that we are all, in a sense, responsible for the health of the internet and for its functioning, and to address and identify what these threats are, we're not going to have that balance and that mix right. So we can talk about liability and things like that, and maybe that's part of the mix, maybe it's not. But I think we really have to sit down and say, okay, how are we going to address this for our common good? Because that's what's missing in this discussion right now. And just to say that, yes, there is an imminent threat, but I think at the same time we have to recognize there's incredible potential as well. Let's not look at this from purely the threat side, because we also have the capability of addressing those threats. Updating Windows 7, that would seem to be a pretty obvious thing to do, but that's about responsibility again, right? And that lies somewhere in the NHS as well, right? That responsibility. So that we have to look at these things in some balance. Thanks.
So, yep. I have a, yeah, go ahead, and then, yeah, go ahead.
Matthew and I have known each other for quite a while, but I'm going to have to be very, very diplomatic and disagree with you, and I'll tell you why. And perhaps we might be splitting hairs. I am not a believer that the shared responsibility model applies here, primarily because there is a greater responsibility, I believe, on the side of the manufacturer before the side of the consumer. So, when we talk about IoT devices made in millions of them and then made in China and sent over here from the toys to everything else, yes, we can go and say that the consumer has to become aware. But the truth of the matter is there is a greater responsibility on the manufacturer. There's a greater responsibility of those who are elected officials to do what is necessary to protect us. And so far, majority, no disrespect to politicians, but yeah, maybe sometimes it's duly applied, most of them have no clue, and they're only talking about what makes them and keeps them in power. The truth of the matter here is this threat is imminent, and unless we do something about it to at least alleviate it, the potential that you and I believe in will never be realized.
So I want to go a little bit towards action before we go back to the panel. Because I do think, looking around the world, that the discussion here in Great Britain, in the UK, is quite advanced. The code of conduct is an output of a process, and I haven't seen many outputs like this across the international sphere. As for actions, I do believe we have Stephen from ARM here. ARM is and I'm not going to advertise for ARM here, but I will. I actually will. ARM is a chip producer, and they produce chips that are used in many. I'm looking for my nose here. Yeah, in many devices. It's, this is stuff that's embedded everywhere. What they've done is they basically said, industry, we have here a platform. We create a platform, a development platform with all kinds of security modules in it, so we can make the mistakes for you, in essence. Basically offering a secure development environment that provides privacy and security modules and encryption and software upgradability and all those type of good stuff. That system is called Pelion. Look for it, Pelion framework. I think that is an approach, and I don't want to talk to you for you, Stephen, but I think that is an approach where industry actually takes up some responsibility by saying, stepping back and saying, what is in our purview. Now, we're talking about ARM, we're talking about big companies, Silicon Valley. I'm a little bit more concerned about the long tail. So what do we do about that long tail? What do we do with the smaller companies? What do we do with the Chinese manufacturers that provide the small boards? Stephen.
And thank you very much for that wonderful advert for ARM technology.
I was offered the beer.
While we're on that theme, I could add a couple more, but I mean, we do certainly take this very seriously. I'm going to mention, Olaf mentioned the Pelion platform, and then we have something else called Platform Security Architecture. But apart from the plug, I'm going to try and kind of answer your question a little bit. I'm going to answer your question actually by saying this. 95% of mobile phones run on ARM technology. So if you can get the ecosystem to start to take up proper technologies, actually, if it's good, it can become pervasive very, very quickly. And that's our, of course, ambition, working with others. So it's not impossible to try and change the way the industry thinks about this. I just want to touch on a couple of things linked to that. And I'll say something slightly provocative. I mean, I think we've had a great discussion. It's an old quotation, actually, and I've heard much that was good and new. Unfortunately, that which was good was not new, and that which was new was not good. We go to these discussions and we hear similar ideas all the time. And I think we need to move the debate forward. We do need to move beyond a debate where we blame consumers for not having sufficiently sophisticated passwords. I mean, all the campaigns I've seen, Google ran one in London a couple of years ago, think of a clever password, and it hasn't, it's made a bit of difference, but it hasn't actually solved the problem. when we talk about the contract, the social contract, we're talking about industry trying to help society solve those problems. And that's where the technology might be able to make a difference. And the second point I'm going to make is I think it's wrong to think of this in terms of, and I know people haven't, it's wrong to think of this in terms of China and everyone else, or China and the West, so on. You know, you've got to think of the problem a company has. Why do companies not introduce security? Because actually, there's loads of much more secure technology around. Why do companies not introduce it? They don't introduce it either because they want to get to market much faster than they think the security will allow them. They want to produce a product that's much cheaper. Or, and Chris raised this at the very beginning, they want to highlight other features. They want a light bulb that's got umpteen shades of grey instead of actually a light bulb that they can say, this is a really secure light bulb. And that's something we have to change, and which the market has to work to change. So in the end, the assumption is let's not put out anything as a company, as a part of the long tail of small companies. The default position you must get into is nothing is going to sell unless it's reasonably secure. And you start to build, that's what we mean by security by design. You start from an assumption that you are using the Pelion platform or whatever you want to use that's going to make your device pretty secure. And that's how I think industry will best drive this forward.
Thank you. I'm going to take a few questions from the room, and then the answers to that will also be the closing remarks of the panelists. So I saw.
I think the key problem here is the one that Patrick mentioned, and that is that no one has got a good solution to where liability lies in interconnected software. And I think if we took a concrete example and tried to work out how you would deal with liability in that, we might make some progress. And the kind of example I would suggest is something like, so we've all been in the problem where you have an application that's meant to be secure on your phone is meant to be secure, the network you're using is meant to be secure, and they're all interfaces. Something goes completely wrong, you lose money, you lose your identity data or something, and everyone says it's not my fault. Now, those interfaces that are so important. If in those examples that we know are happening now, we could work out how to sort out liability and how manufacturers should work together to agree in the same way that banks, when they're doing transfers, agree millisecond by millisecond. It's now my liability, it's now your liability if this money gets lost in transit. Then we've got a potential way forward, and I don't know if you would agree with that and you think that is practical and possible.
There was a question over there, the gentleman over there. Raise your hand if you have a question or... Thank you, go ahead.
Alp Toker from digital rights group NetBlocks. So I'm actually going to speak as a consumer, I think, and this is something that personally has troubled me. When I have an IoT device, I have this product that I bought, I might not even know that it's an IoT device. But how do I know what data it's transmitting? There seems to be no real-time transparency method, nothing that I can actually tell what is being sent out. And I think the public has a right to know what the devices they're actually purchasing transmits. So, we look at the big picture, the liability and international responsibilities, but there seems to be a very pressing need to actually support the rights of the individual and the consumer in terms of what data is going in and out of these boxes.
Privacy of the box. I said I will take more questions, but I see I have only 5 minutes left, so I want to give the floor to the panelists. You each have 1 minute either to address a question or have a concluding remark. Starting off with Matthew, because you were last. first time.
Yes, on the question of data, there's another challenge, which is many of these IoT devices, which you may not know is an IoT device, actually retain the data within the device. So when you either sell it or dispose of it, you're not actually guaranteed that that data is gone. So yes, I think that is a serious concern. That comes back to kind of like privacy by design. We're talking about security by design, what about privacy by design with these devices as well? The other issue is...
Sorry? Think of when you sell your house.
Right.
For instance. Yeah.
So, and then the other issue is we've been here before. We've changed mindsets before. We've moved from old world styled light bulbs, not even IoT light bulbs, to LED light bulbs, right? So we've had a change of heart. That's been brought about through recognition of efficiency gains. That's been brought about by regulation as well. So there's a mix of measures that can be brought about to change the way that we address things like security and IoT devices. Thanks.
Yeah, thank you. I think I'd like to go back to the point of the responsibility of the consumer, just to push back a little bit. And I think, yes, the manufacturer and like changing the mindset and all of that. But if we look at for example, the guidelines, the 13 guidelines, the points from the code, we'll see stuff like no default password, keep software updated, communicate securely, which are also like stuff that we advise people to do. So I don't like to kind of talk about IoT security as like a standalone thing, and this is kind of like one thing that we look at it in a certain way, and we look at like our different online practices in a different light. I think when we talk about digital social contract, which is a term that I like, I think it kind of brings with it like responsibilities on both sides, on manufacturers and also on consumers. So I think we need to come, especially that with the development of technology, with the change of the threats, etc., we need to kind of keep raising the awareness and kind of keep engaging everyone, again, going back to the issue of common language. Thank you.
Great. I think just going back to your point around sort of data emission and the rights of consumers, this is probably the first cybersecurity panel I've sat on in a couple of years where no one's mentioned the four-letter acronym GDPR. It's great, so I'm going to mention it now. I think GDPR wills and is starting to create a bit of a generational cultural shift in how consumers view the use of their data, but also how companies will utilize and use data as well. It's not going to happen overnight, but like I said, this is a generational shift. IoT is becoming the norm. We are seeing a new generation where, for them, privacy should be the norm as well as devices being connected. The last point I want to say is that we shouldn't see, although we're big supporters of the code of practice, but Ed will be one to agree as well, this isn't the silver bullet. This code of practice is not the answer to all of our problems. We don't want to give the consumer a false sense of security in thinking that if all a company needs to do is abide by the 13 codes and they're entirely secure, entirely safe, there is no such thing. So let's not see this as the answer to all of our problems.
I'd just like to conclude actually on a different note, because this is something I wish we would have had time to address. But I think one thing is important to address security not just as a completely abstract concept, because I know we talked about the figure of the hacker with the hoodie and the dark face, but security is also something we experience in our day-to-day lives, and especially I think, again, with IoT devices, there will be new challenges in the sense of like, well, your first threat might be your partner. I mean, in the UK, we have like one woman dying of domestic violence every 3 days. When we see the first occurrences of IoT devices that people have started buying, like Amazon Echoes or Google Home, and the default setting is that you have a common account for everyone, which means that when you have a person who's in the house doing, research on, like, well, asking the device question or listening to music, or just even notifying their presence in the house, the main account holder will receive an alert on their phone to notify them of the activity, which, for anyone who's had any experience working with survivors of domestic violence is a real problem, is a real security risk. So I just also hope that we can take into those risks and those security risks into account when we talk about cybersecurity. It's not just the hackers, it's also the people who are living with.
Well, I feel like wanting to be momentarily about this issue, just momentarily. You'll have to allow me 1 minute.
1 minute then. 1 minute.
I think that this is much too important an issue. It's not just a just discovering the light thing. It's actually to do with the very survival of humanity, because AI, for example, has huge implications. And as someone mentioned, that China, for example, claims that it will become the leading nation in AI by 2020. Now, it seems to me what is really important, but Britain is quite ahead on these issues, which we should be proud of. But I think with this to do with global partnership. Now, what we need is a global, rather a rule-based world to do with IoT and AI. And in that process, what I think, I'm suggesting this to ISOC and ICANN, that actually what we need is a global approach to this. China and Japan need to be critically part of this. This cannot be a monologue between Western nations, no more. Japan and China are critically important to this debate, in which North America, Britain and Europe are part of, And I think in that, what we need is a working group in which the whole world's best minds are brought together, anthropologists, sociologists, politicians, lawyers, and every other specialisms are brought together to talk about what is this rule-based world we want, in which AI, IoT are critically important for the very survival of humanity, in my view.
Thank you. Thank you for that addition. Stephen, you are the one that has the last word.
I don't know what to say.
Feel free to address.
I'm going to actually pick up, in public on Eva's point. I was going to tell her privately, but actually I've also been involved in the Cambridge, our office is in Cambridge, in the Cambridge domestic violence campaign. And Eva's absolutely right to highlight something which is often disregarded. I wasn't quite sure I caught what you said, but if there's any way in which the technology can help, I think we'd be very interested in talking to you about it. I'll pick up your point. I think one of the historic issues, unfortunately, is that international agreements tend only to take place when there has been an atrocity in advance. When you think of the control of nuclear weapons or the laws against genocide and so on and so forth. Now, I very much hope that we can avoid having an atrocity take place. Because I do think, and this is my last word, I'm going to start where I started at the beginning, I do think AI might provide an interesting way forward for some of this stuff. And I've just finished up this one point. I mean, there is a market failure. If you buy an internet-connected CCTV camera, you may not be bothered that anyone else can see the images. You're only interested in that you can see the images and make sure there isn't an intruder on your back step. And if someone says to you, the problem is that that camera could be taken over and used to bombard the nearby hospital or power station or whatnot, you might say, not my problem, mate. Sorry, that's the government's problem. That's the power station's problem. It's society's problem. And unless we can find a way of effectively policing these networks on behalf of the good of society, we will always risk being vulnerable.
Thank you. It is incredibly hard to wrap this whole session up. To me, this indicates yet again that this is a multifaceted and very important problem. We talked about international global stability, the fate of the planet itself, both in optimistic but also in pessimistic ways. We talked about the tool set and the importance of a tool set like the Code of Conduct, which I think I heard everybody agree that that is a good piece of work to actually move something forward. But I also think that we all said it's not enough. And that we haven't quite worked out where the responsibilities are and how they relate to each other. I think that is the ongoing conversation where we have to continue figuring things out. But that's my takeaway. Your takeaway might be completely different, and I would love to hear that at the bar. Thank you very much. And for our panelists,